So I got this question. I wonder how old all of us would be if we lived on Saturn. Like if we all, instead of living here, instead of Earth, we lived on Saturn, how old we would be, like how we'd measure that. And I know I say that out loud at the beginning of a sermon, and you're thinking, Drew, that's a ridiculous question. Why are you talking about how old we would be if we lived on Saturn? And I know it's a ridiculous question because, as everyone knows, you can't live on Saturn. It's a gas giant. We're solid people, not gas people. Some of us, at least. So you have to have solid ground. I know you all know you can't actually live on a gas planet, so that's a ridiculous question. I know I'm obviously talking about the Saturn lunar system, of course. Of course I am. I mean, there's 62 moons surrounding Saturn. I'm, of course, talking about one of the 62 moons to live on Saturn, of course. And I know you're also completely thinking, well, Drew, that's also a ridiculous question. And I know, I get it, it's a ridiculous question because I said 62, and everybody knows that there's only 61 that are even potentially inhabitable because there's Enceladus, this ice moon that just spits water and ice at Saturn all the time. We can't live there. That's like Hoth. We can't live there. I know, I mean, that's the planet, or that's the moon, that's, destroying the rings of Saturn. It spits all this water and whether chemicals are there, and the rings of Saturn are going away at a really rapid rate, too. Scientists actually think that within the next 300 million years, the rings of Saturn will be gone. So, we need to book that vacation quickly. 300 million years, it's gone. So, okay, I know, obviously, you know all of this. I know all of this. I'm not being ridiculous. I get it. I know when I say Saturn, I mean the moons of Saturn. And I know when I say the moons, I'm not counting the ice moon. So it's only one of 61. So, of course, what I mean is I wonder how old we would be if we lived on one of the 61 moons of Saturn. And I think if we get past all the obvious ridiculousness of the question, it's actually an interesting ask. You see, we measure time in a couple different ways. Two real major ways that we measure time here in this world. And it's very different here than on Saturn. You see, I am 34 years old, which is to say this: I have been alive for the world, Earth, to have gone around the sun 34 times. That's how old I am in years. The thing is, Saturn goes around the sun at a different rate. In fact, it only goes around the sun once every 29 years of our years. Which means on Saturn, if I count it like that, I'm only 1.2 years old. I'm a 14-month-old. I'm crying. I need a bottle. I need a nap all afternoon. 1.2 years old. That's one way of measuring it. So on Saturn, I'm a little baby. By one way that we count this. But you see, there's another way we count the passage of time. You see, our planet spins around. It does so in a full spin, about 24 hours or so. We call that a day. If you add up, 365 of those, you get a year. Which means if I am 34 years old, I've been alive for 12,400 or so of those days. Give or take a few. Well, as it turns out on Saturn, it spins really, really, really fast. About 2.5 times faster than us. To be exact, it takes 10 hours and 33 minutes of our spinning for Saturn to spin. So it's going real slow around the sun, but it is whipping around. Which means 12,400-ish days on Saturn, or the Saturn lunar system, I'm going to go ahead and assume it's all the same, is close to 28,000 days. for us on Saturn. From that perspective, I'm 76 years old. So depending on how you want to look at it, I'm either a widow baby or a dignified elderly gentleman on Saturn. Depending on the respect you have for me, you pick which image you want. I'm 1 or 76. That's Saturn. And now that we've talked about Saturn, let's talk about an ancient church in a city called Ephesus. The greatest bridge of all time in a sermon. So the ancient church in Ephesus, 2,000 years ago or so, was planted by the Apostle Paul. Most of the churches back then were, and so the Apostle Paul planted this church in this Greek city within the Roman Empire. And it didn't really go well at first. I think a lot of times we get in our head that Paul is he's successful. Everywhere he goes, he just goes and he preaches and teaches and plants and things are fine and everything's great. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes he goes and there's no real issues. But sometimes he goes and he struggles and struggles and struggles. And Ephesus was a really important city, at least at one point in history. And Paul really wanted a church there, and it was not happening. So Paul doesn't go and hang out there for weeks and months and then leaves. He goes and stays for 2 full years in Ephesus, trying to get a foothold, trying to get a community of believers who will follow Jesus and set up a place there for Christianity. And so it took him about 2 years, but eventually he started making headway. And it was very, very good news for the church, for Christianity, for Paul, but it was actually also very bad news for the church, Christianity, and Paul. That's because Ephesus was a city that thought that they were specifically chosen by a god to be a special representative on earth of that religion. The god was actually a goddess. It was Artemis. And the Ephesian people believed that Artemis was their special god, that Ephesus was Artemis's very special city. And so what they did was they took great pride in their religion. Their religion was not just about what they worshiped. It was about who they were as people. It's about who they were civically. It's about who they were as families, as a community. And so people were none too happy for a new religion to come to town and start taking away from that. And by that I mean there were some specific people who were extremely unhappy. And those are the people who made money off the religion of Artemis. Religion has always been a great moneymaker, no matter which religion it is. And specifically, there were some guys who worked with silver. We call them silversmiths. And these guys, they built and crafted and sold idols, statues of Artemis and her god friends, and they sold those. And here comes Christianity teaching people not to worship the gods of the Ephesians, not to worship the gods of the Greeks at all, or the Romans. They were saying, don't worship idols. And here's these people whose entire financial status is based on making and selling idols. And so going off of their own financial insecurity, going to the people who were already very, very proud of who they were as religious people who worshiped Artemis, they got themselves a good old-fashioned bloody riot. And they dragged Christians into the streets. And they just turned over the whole city. And it was so bad. The pressure was so terrible that Paul, who had spent 2 full years ministering to this city, was forced to leave, abandon his post, abandon his ministry, and get out of town. The church at Ephesus then was a persecuted one. They were a church that struggled. And if that was all they struggled with, being the outsiders here in this city where they're all very, very proud of being those who worship Artemis, the special possession of Artemis, that would be enough to make the Ephesian church a struggling one. But we're just getting started. You see, it's not just the Greeks they had to worry about. They also had to worry about the Romans. And also the pro-Roman Greeks. We don't think about this very often. We think, oh, in the Roman Empire, the Romans just subjugated everybody. But you see, people are alike all over, and it's very hard to subjugate people who think. And so there were many places throughout the Roman Empire where the Romans, they were in charge, but they didn't have the hearts and the minds of the people. People pushed back. This is what goes on in Israel, by the way. But people pushed back. People didn't want to get in line. People wanted no part of the Caesar or the eagle or the throne or anything associated with Rome. And everything I just described was not Ephesus. For whatever reason, Ephesus loved Rome. They looked to Rome as an extension of Artemis. They saw the Caesar as a god. There's this imperial cult. The Romans had taught that the Caesar was divine, and in most places, people pushed back against that idea. But in Ephesus, they welcomed it. They worshipped the Caesar as much as they worshipped anyone else. That didn't cut into the business, by the way, of the silversmiths. And so to say Jesus is Lord, which is absolutely a political claim that says no one else is, for them to confess, for the Christians to confess that we follow Jesus, which means we do not follow anyone else, oh, they put themselves in the crosshairs of the empire in a unique way that we don't see everywhere in the ancient world. So there's two fronts of persecution and hostility. The Greeks who worship Artemis, and the Romans and their friends who taught Caesar was Lord. And if that was enough, if that was all, that would be enough for this to be a terrible, difficult place to live. But the truth of the matter is, at the point in time that Paul plants this church, we need to understand something. We don't think of it very often like this, but really the persecution at that point wasn't from Rome. We're about 5 to 10 years before the Romans really get their persecution of the church going. The Greeks usually don't do a lot of persecuting because they're usually a live and let live. We read about this Artemis situation because it was novel and unique. It wasn't something you saw every day. That's why it was significant enough to write it down in the Bible. Really, the persecution came from Jewish folks like what Paul used to be. Jewish folks who were very unhappy at the heretical, blasphemous charge that Jesus was the divine Son of God himself. The people you really needed to worry about for, 25 years or so within persecution were the Jewish people. So really, as long as there was no large Jewish community in and around Ephesus, they really would have been fine with just the Greeks and the Romans. Except, there was a really large Jewish community in and around Ephesus who had every reason to be mad because Paul had baptized a whole mess of them. And so what you see is between about 35 years that we can see the church existing up until the end of the New Testament era, you've got 30 to 40 years, 35 years, we'll call it, they received persecution from three fronts. From the Greeks who hated them because they didn't worship Artemis, from the Romans and the Greeks who loved the Romans because they didn't say that Caesar was Lord, and now the Jewish people who looked at them and saw that they were losing members of their community to that community over what they saw as a heresy and blasphemy worthy of the death penalty. To be a Christian in Ephesus was exceedingly difficult. They had to be bullheaded, stubborn, hardy people. They had to be resolute in what they believed. They had to look and know what the truth was and hold on to that truth for dear life. And the good news is that in the New Testament era, by almost everything we can find, the church at Ephesus was a crown jewel of the Christian world. These people did exactly that. They held on. They preached the truth. What they did was beautiful. They showed love instead of fear. They showed light instead of darkness. They stood for a God of life instead of death. Their ideas about God were fundamentally different than the ideas of the Jewish people and the Greek people and the Roman people, and they held on for dear life. Now, they had some advantages. Paul preached there. I mean, he was there for 2 years. Obviously, that was a big deal. We know that the Apostle John comes along later on. He lives there. He preaches there. They've got some advantages. They've got some privileges other people didn't have, but they used those privileges for good, and they did amazing things with it. And that's what makes the book of Revelation so surprising. You see, Revelation is a series of visions where John is shown things by Jesus. One of the things he's shown is a series of letters that he should write to 7 churches in the ancient world. And one of those churches is the church at Ephesus. And here's what we read from that letter in Revelation chapter 2. Jesus says to the angel of the church in Ephesus, write, I know your works, your toil, your patient endurance, how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. I mean, you read all that stuff up until the last sentence, you think, yeah, great, these guys are amazing. There's not a church in church history that doesn't want Jesus to say that about them. Until that last part. And that last part's extremely important because remember, as we read from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, that without love we have nothing. And Jesus tells the Ephesians, you have nothing because you don't have the love that you had at first. Cool, you know the truth. Cool, you can teach accurately. Cool, all these things are great. Cool, you're holding on in the face of persecution. Awesome, but what does that matter if you don't have the love that made you want to be a Christian in the first place? The love for God, the love for other people, the love for this philosophy and ideology, the love for this community and this lifestyle. The thing that made you say at first, I will have a fundamentally different understanding of God and people and life than the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans, that thing that made you do that massive change, Jesus said, you've lost it. You have no passion. You have no imagination. You have no love. Jesus calls an incredible church that stands on truth. A stubborn church that holds up under 3 prongs, the unholy trinity of persecution. And he says, I've got a problem with you. Because the love that was the foundation of who you were is gone. And without love, we have nothing. So the question is this. What is that thing that the Ephesians had at first? And I'll be honest, I don't know. I mean, like, nobody knows. Jesus didn't qualify, but I think I have an idea. I do. I think I've got an idea. I think there's an attitude, a perspective, an understanding, something very neat that the Ephesians have that no one else has. We read it in the book of Ephesians. We read a very fascinating idea that they would have had 35 years before Jesus says anything. The kind of attitude, perspective, kind of idea that they would have had that made them want to be Christian in the first place. And here's where it is. It's in Ephesians chapter 4, and it says this. Each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive, and he gave gifts to his people. When it says he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended is the same one who ascended far above all of the heavens, so that he might fill all things. Here's what's interesting. We see a couple of these ideas vaguely, but only in Ephesians, only in this letter to this church that's persecuted, do we see these ideas articulated exactly like this. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get to the headline first. The headline is that last sentence. That through the ministry of Christ, through what Christ has done, through the beauty of who Christ is, he has filled all things. What does that mean? What that means is that Christ is all around us. What that means is that there is nowhere we can escape the love of God. There is nowhere, anywhere, that God's love is absent. Heaven, earth, above, below, where Christ ascended and descended, past, present, future, nowhere that we can escape God's love, because God's love through Christ is in all things, in all people, in all circumstances, in all places, everywhere. Through his ministry, Christ has filled all things. One of my favorite translations that I didn't use for various reasons quotes this as, Christ has filled the universe with himself. So if we want to get an idea of what exactly it means for Christ to fill all things, let's talk about Saturn. Imagine that I'm a 76-year-old man or an elderly baby living on one of Saturn's moons. Guess what? Christ is there. The love of Christ is there. The provision of Christ is there. On Saturn and all of its moons, whether we can live on them or not, Christ is holding them. There's that old song, he has the whole world in his hands. That is a small, small idea here, because that's not what's going on. Christ has all of creation, all of reality, the whole universe in his hands. Not only that, Jesus is the king of Saturn, which sounds stupid and ridiculous, but it's true. Christ is Lord on Saturn, and even that Hoth-like planet that's destroying all the rings. Christ is Lord and King and Savior there too. We could live on Saturn, and we are still under the umbrella of the love of Christ. And you can see how this idea is very helpful to the Ephesian Christians. Because if that's the way Christ is, if that's how massive God's love is, that you can go nowhere and escape it, what's it matter if the Jews hate me? What's it matter if the Romans hate me? What's it matter if the Greeks want us dead? Christ is Lord of the entire universe. He is Lord of all realities. He is Lord of the multiverse, if we want to talk about that. He is the Lord everywhere. And so our problems, real problems, well, they pale in comparison to the glory and magnitude of Christ. And the reason they believed that was because of two things Jesus did. Jesus ascended, and he descended. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. Over the last 2,000 years of church history, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people have had lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas of what this means. But my favorite ideas come from our church fathers, the ones who wrote a creed as an ancient baptismal confession for people who couldn't read. They saw these as such foundational ideas, such massive, perspective-altering notions. They put it in the fundamental foundation of what Christianity is. Here's what we read from the Apostles' Creed we've been talking about for the last month and a half. That I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. Here's the big part now. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, and he will come to judge the living and the dead. What this means is this. We're talking two very specific events that change everything. After Jesus was killed, dead, and buried, according to our church fathers, Jesus went to hell. Hell's a terrible translation, by the way. Awful. Because when we think of hell, we think of the guy in tights with the pitchfork. We think of fire and torture forever. Not at all what they thought about in any way with hell. The better translation is just death, and a lot of different denominations, as they do this, they'll just say death on this. But he went to hell, he went to death, he went to the grave. Jesus dies, and then he goes to the place of the dead, where dead people are. And there, which we read from 1 Peter, Peter's first letter to the church. We're good at naming things. Peter's first letter to the church. He tells us that while Jesus was there, he preached the good news to spirits long dead, all the way back to the days of Noah, all the way back. These people have been dead for millennia, forever, these dead people with no hope. And Jesus preaches the gospel, and here's the big part, and they're saved. Jesus, this cannot be stressed enough, Jesus, according to Peter, according to our church fathers, Jesus goes to the place of the dead. He goes to hell, and he saves people in it after they died. How? Understand, we think Jesus has this mastery over death so very often because of the resurrection. This is all before the resurrection. So powerful is Jesus that he can save dead people from death, literally, before a resurrection from the dead. That's how powerful Jesus is. That's how far the lengths that his love will go and does go. And then after that, about a month later or so, a month and some change later, he tells his disciples, now it's your turn to do ministry. And he shares the Great Commission that we base what we do on, that every church bases what they do on. He gives them very specific instruction. And then we're told he levitated into the air and disappeared into the sky, an event that was so crazy, the apostles literally just stood and watched until an angel showed up and said, no, guys, you got to go do something now. Like that. You're just looking at the sky now. And Jesus ascends to a place in an eternal realm of heaven where he has an eternal throne as the King of heaven. Understand, we think of heaven, we think of hell, we think of life eternal, we think of death. Whatever we think of those phrases, Jesus shows his love is a master over all of it, in heaven, in hell, death, life. Everywhere he goes, Jesus' love reigns supreme. He has filled all things with himself. He has filled the universe, Saturn, Earth, up, down, living, dead. It doesn't matter. And the Ephesians saw this. And it changed everything. And the early church saw this, and it changed everything. You want to know why they all were willing to be martyrs? These guys willingly marched themselves to death, marched themselves into arenas to die. Because when their king is the king of Saturn and the grave itself and heaven, what choice do they have other than glorify, sing praise at who their king is under all circumstances? The Ephesian church lost that, I think. And I think so too do we. And so our sixth lesson from the Creed of our fathers is a lesson we don't think all that much about sometimes, but we should. because it's true, is this: the love of the one who has filled all things with himself is greater than any problem that we face. The love of the one who has filled all things with himself is greater than any problem that we face. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. And I was grossly underqualified for that. I'm going to look at me. I'm not an astronaut. This is not the body of an astronaut. But I was obsessed with space. I was obsessed with stars and planets, and that's why I love science fiction so much. I mean, me loving Star Wars and later Doctor Who and all that, I mean, that's just a little kid talking about how much he loves the stars, is all that is. But eventually I grew out of it, because there's real problems. There's real stuff to talk about. Eventually, you lose your imagination that you had as a kid. And that's fine, in a lot of ways. But Paul said that Christ filled the universe with himself. At least a translation of Paul says. A psalmist said that the heavens testify to the glory of God. God speaks to us in a lot of ways. And we think, okay, God speaks to us through the Bible. That's great. Absolutely does. But you guys realize, if Christ is everywhere, then God is everywhere and love is everywhere, then God's communication with us is in no way limited to a book or the people we are as adults who've lost their imagination. And I can't help but wonder how much God wanted to say to me through my obsession with space, and how much I've missed out on because I'm not looking up every time I go outside. Because it's just stars. The dumbest sentence in the world. It's just stars. You know what a star is? It happens to all of us, and it happens because we have problems. It happens because, okay, fine, maybe we don't live the lives of the Ephesians do, but we all have problems. And look, I'm not saying that our problems aren't real. They are. Our problems are real and valid. And sometimes our problems make us want to give up on our faith in Jesus entirely. And that's a real and valid desire. It happens. And sometimes our problems make us just real cranky as we follow Jesus. And that's real. That's a real problem. Those are real valid things. We see the earliest church who couldn't read. They understood that in this ascension to the heavens, to this descension to death, Jesus showed his love is everywhere. There is nowhere where Christ's love is absent. And they didn't know a lot, but I wonder how much they knew more than us because they remembered that idea. And so we are invited, we are called to have an imagination. Man, I don't know what half this stuff means. Literally, you should have questions about what it means Jesus went to the grave, what it means that Jesus has a throne in heaven. You should have, if you don't have questions, by the way, you miss those parts of the sermon. Like you should have questions. And my answer is, I have no idea. It's real weird and mysterious, and I don't know. I have questions too. But it's also real cool, isn't it? It takes an imagination. And if our faith lacks imagination, I think Jesus is inviting us to once again return to our first love. Because none of us decided to follow Jesus the first time. None of us accepted Jesus, prayed a prayer, got baptized, whatever. None of us did that without an imagination. So we just need to make sure we always have it. This morning, the musicians can come forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer this invitation. You all know what it is. Repent and be baptized. Nobody in this room is in any way confused about that. If you're already immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this is not it. We do serve a perfect God. No one in this room is remotely confused about the invitation I'm giving right now. There's so much ice outside, no visitors. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, call, and cultivate. We want to meet new people, share the gospel, grow up while we do it. We want to do so with an imagination as we stand and as we sing.